Billionaire falls for a homeless woman. His family's reaction will break your heart. The sky was a heavy gray, the kind that seemed to weigh on everyone beneath it. Alexander Sterling leaned against the sleek black car parked at the side of the road, tapping impatiently at his phone. The flashing hazard lights reflected off the damp pavement, illuminating his expensive leather shoes and tailored suit. He was a man of immeasurable wealth, yet in that moment, stranded with a flat tire and no reception, all of his resources felt utterly useless. Alexander cursed under his breath, glancing up and down the empty road. He had been on his way back to the city after a retreat with his company's board members, a weekend filled with forced laughter and shallow conversations about profits and acquisitions. The truth was, Alexander found little joy in his fortune these days. Every deal felt hollow, every gala a repeat of the last. He could buy anything he wanted, yet contentment always seemed just out of reach. As he stood there, lost in his frustration, a faint voice broke through his thoughts. "Need some help?" He turned toward the sound and saw a woman standing a few feet away. Her clothes were worn and mismatched, a faded hoodie over a long skirt, but her posture was confident, and her sharp blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once. She held a small plastic bag filled with what looked like canned goods, her fingers red from the cold. Alexander hesitated, his instincts urging him to brush her off. She didn't belong in his world, that much was clear. But there was something in her gaze that held him, something unflinching and honest. "I've got a flat," he said finally, his tone clipped but not unkind. "No reception to call for help." The woman stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "Lucky for you, I know my way around a tire," she said with a small smile. "Do you have a spare?" Alexander blinked, surprised. "You know how to change a tire?" "Doesn't everyone?" she replied, setting her bag on the ground. "Pop the trunk. I'll show you." For a moment, Alexander considered declining. He wasn't used to accepting help, especially from strangers. But the thought of standing in the cold for another hour outweighed his pride. He pressed the button on his key fob, and the trunk clicked open. The woman rolled up her sleeves and got to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Alexander watched in silence, his curiosity growing. She didn't look like someone who had an easy life. Her clothes were patched, and there was a tiredness in her features that spoke of long days and hard nights. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that intrigued him. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Clara," she said without looking up. "And you?" "Alexander." She chuckled softly. "Alexander. Sounds fancy." "It's just a name," he replied, unsure if she was teasing him. "Well, Alexander, you're lucky I came along. This could have been a long night for you." When she finished, Clara stood and wiped her hands on a rag she'd pulled from her bag. "All set," she said. "You should be good to go." Alexander opened his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Thank you." "Here." Clara's smile faded, and she shook her head. "I don't want your money." He frowned, unsure how to respond. "It's just a gesture of appreciation." "I don't need your gestures," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Take care of your car, and maybe next time, don't wait for someone else to fix things for you." Before he could say anything else, she picked up her bag and walked away, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the approaching night. Alexander stood there, the bill still in his hand, feeling something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't frustration or embarrassment, it was curiosity, a nagging sense that he had just crossed paths with someone who saw the world in a way he never could. That night, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Clara. Her refusal of his money, her confidence, her ease in a situation he would have found unbearable. It all lingered in his mind. In his world, every interaction came with an expectation, every favor a transaction. But Clara had helped him without asking for anything in return. She had treated him like an equal, not a billionaire, and that was something he wasn't used to. The next day, as Alexander sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city, he found himself distracted. The sprawling skyline, with its gleaming towers and endless traffic, felt more suffocating than inspiring. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Sterling, your meeting with the investors is in 10 minutes. Reschedule it," Alexander said, standing abruptly. The assistant blinked, startled. "Reschedule, sir?" "But I need to step out," Alexander said, grabbing his coat. "Just handle it." Without waiting for a response, he left the office and took the elevator to the ground floor. He wasn't entirely sure where he was going, but his feet seemed to have a mind of their own. He thought about the area where he had met Clara, the empty road on the edge of the city. Something told him that if he returned, he might find her again. After an hour of searching, Alexander spotted her sitting on a bench in a small park, her bag of belongings beside her. She was eating a sandwich, her gaze focused on a group of children playing nearby. He approached slowly, unsure of how to start the conversation. "Clara," he said, stopping a few feet away. She looked up, her expression cautious. "Alexander," she replied. "Did your car break down again?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, it's fine. I just wanted to thank you." "Properly." "You already tried that," she said, taking another bite of her sandwich. "I mean it this time," he said, sitting on the bench beside her. "No money, no strings. Just, thank you." Clara studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're welcome." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question," Clara said, her tone light but wary. "How did you end up here? On this bench in this park?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's a long story," she said. "And not a very happy one." "I'd like to hear it," Alexander said gently. Clara glanced at him, her blue eyes searching his face. She seemed to weigh his sincerity before nodding slowly. She said, "But don't say I didn't warn you." As she began to speak, her voice steady but tinged with sadness, Alexander listened intently. She told him about the series of misfortunes that had led her to this point, a lost job, an eviction, and the difficulty of starting over when the world seemed determined to knock her down. But even as she recounted her struggles, there was no self-pity in her tone. She spoke with a quiet strength that made Alexander admire her even more. When she finished, Alexander was silent for a moment. "You're incredible," he said finally. Clara laughed, a soft, incredulous sound. "Incredible? I'm sitting on a park bench eating a peanut butter sandwich." "And yet, you're still here," Alexander said. "Still standing, still fighting. That's incredible." Clara shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "You're strange, Alexander. You don't belong in a place like this." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I'm starting to think I've spent too much time in the places I do belong." Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Clara after their conversation in the park. Her strength, her quiet dignity, and the way she carried herself despite everything life had thrown at her. It was unlike anyone he had ever met. In his world, people wore masks, their polished exteriors hiding motives and ambitions that always came with a price. But Clara was raw and real, and that made her unforgettable. Over the next week, Alexander found himself returning to the park. At first, he wasn't sure if she would even be there, but each time he arrived, she was sitting on the same bench, her bag by her side. He brought her coffee one morning, hesitantly handing her the steaming cup as he sat down. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, eyeing the coffee but accepting it anyway. "I wanted to," Alexander replied. "Besides, it's freezing out here." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. "Thanks," she said quietly, her guard slipping just a little. Their conversations became more frequent, and Clara slowly began to open up. She talked about the things she missed. A real home, the feeling of security, the chance to dream about the future without the weight of survival pressing down on her. But she never complained. Instead, she spoke with a kind of resolve that Alexander found humbling. One day, after sharing a laugh over something trivial, Alexander asked her a question that had been on his mind for days. "Clara, what do you want to do? I mean, if you could do anything, if money wasn't an issue, what would you want?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "I used to dream about things, art, maybe. I liked drawing when I was younger. But now, I don't let myself think about that stuff. It feels too far away." Alexander frowned, leaning forward. "It doesn't have to be far away. You're talented, Claire. I've seen the way you look at the world, the way you think. You could do anything if you had the chance. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is, Alexander said. Maybe you just need someone to believe in you. Clara looked at him then, her expression unreadable. Why are you doing this, Alexander? Why do you keep coming back? The question caught him off guard, but he didn't hesitate. Because I see something in you, he said honestly. Something real. And I think the world would be better if you had the chance to share that. Clara's gaze softened, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might cry. But she blinked and looked away, her voice steady. You don't know what you're getting yourself into? Maybe not, Alexander said with a small smile. But I'm willing to find out. As the days turned into weeks, their connection grew stronger. Alexander began to invite Clara to join him for small outings, lunch at a quiet cafe, a visit to an art gallery, or a walk through the city's less crowded streets. At first, Clara was hesitant, her discomfort with his world evident in the way she carried herself. But gradually, she began to relax, her natural curiosity and intelligence shining through. One afternoon, as they sat in a sunlit corner of a cafe, Alexander noticed Clara sketching on a napkin. The lines were fluid and precise, forming the outline of a building that seemed to blend modern design with natural elements. That's amazing, he said, leaning closer to get a better look. You're an artist. Clara shrugged, her cheeks flushing. It's just a doodle. It's more than that, Alexander insisted. You have an eye for this. Have you ever thought about pursuing architecture or design? Clara laughed, shaking her head. That's not exactly in the cards for me. It could be, Alexander said, his voice firm. If you wanted it to be. Clara met his gaze, her expression conflicted. You make everything sound so easy, Alexander. But it's not. People like me don't just get to decide to change our lives. Why not? He asked. Why shouldn't you have that chance? Before Clara could respond, a voice interrupted them. Alexander? They both turned to see a well-dressed woman standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of surprise and disapproval. She was impeccably styled, her designer coat and expensive jewelry marking her as someone who belonged firmly in Alexander's world. Mother, Alexander said, standing up. This is Clara. Clara, this is my mother, Evelyn. Clara looked up, her face carefully neutral. Nice to meet you, she said quietly. Evelyn's smile was tight and forced as she glanced at Clara. Likewise, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Turning to Alexander, she added, May I speak with you for a moment? Privately. Alexander hesitated, glancing at Clara, but she gave him a small nod. Go ahead, she said. I'll wait here. He followed his mother to a corner of the cafe, where her expression quickly shifted to one of barely concealed outrage. Alexander, what on earth are you doing? She demanded in a harsh whisper. Who is that woman? Her name is Clara, Alexander said calmly. She's a friend. A friend? Evelyn repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. She stopped herself, lowering her voice further. She's clearly not someone you should be associating with. Alexander's jaw tightened. And why is that? Evelyn gestured toward Clara's table. Look at her, Alexander. She doesn't belong in our world. She's not one of us. That's exactly the point, Alexander said, his voice rising slightly. She's not like us. She's better. Evelyn stared at him, her shock evident. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Alexander said. Clara is intelligent, kind, and genuine, everything our world lacks. Evelyn shook her head, her disbelief turning to anger. This is ridiculous, Alexander. You have responsibilities, a reputation to uphold. You can't throw all of that away for someone like her. Alexander's eyes narrowed. I don't care about reputation, Mother. I care about what's real. And Clara is real. Before Evelyn could respond, Alexander turned and walked back to the table, his determination hardening with each step. He wasn't going to let his family's narrow-mindedness dictate his life any longer. Clara looked up as he approached, her expression questioning. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, Alexander said, his voice steady. Let's get out of here. They left the cafe, the tension lingering in the air. As they walked through the city, Alexander finally spoke. "I need to tell you something." Clara glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" "My family isn't going to make this easy," he admitted. "They don't understand what I see in you." Clara sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I figured as much. People like your family, they don't see people like me." "They don't," Alexander said. "But that's their problem, not ours." Clara stopped walking, turning to face him. "Alexander, I don't want to be the reason you're fighting with your family." "You're not," he said firmly. "The reason is them. Their judgment, their arrogance. I'm done with it, Clara. I'm done letting them control my life." Clara searched his face, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Alexander said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not giving up on you." For the first time in a long time, Clara felt a flicker of hope. But it was quickly tempered by the fear that Alexander's world might be too much for them to overcome. The weeks that followed were a test of strength for both Alexander and Clara. Alexander made a point of including Clara in his life more openly, taking her to events, introducing her to friends, and ignoring the murmurs and whispers that followed them. Claire, for her part, struggled to adjust to the spotlight. She wasn't used to being scrutinized, judged for her appearance, or questioned about her past. The breaking point came at a charity gala hosted by Alexander's family. He had insisted Clara join him, despite her hesitation. "You belong there as much as anyone else," he had said, holding her hand. But Clara had her doubts. The event was held in a grand ballroom, the chandeliers glittering like stars against the high ceiling. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne, and the room buzzed with conversation. Clara wore a simple dress Alexander had gifted her, a tasteful black gown that fit her perfectly, but even with the elegant attire, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. As they entered, all eyes turned toward them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Clara felt her chest tighten. She forced herself to stand tall, holding onto Alexander's arm like an anchor. He leaned down and whispered, "You're doing great. Ignore them." But ignoring the judgmental stares was easier said than done. Throughout the evening, Clara endured polite but probing questions from Alexander's acquaintances, thinly veiled as small talk. "So, Clara, where did you and Alexander meet?" one woman asked, her diamond earrings catching the light as she sipped her champagne. "In the park," Clara replied simply, trying to keep her tone neutral. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "How charming." Another guest chimed in, "And what is it you do, Clara? Are you in the arts? Fashion, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to answer. Before she could respond, Alexander stepped in. "Clara has a talent for design," he said smoothly. "She has an incredible eye for detail." The guests exchanged glances, their polite smiles failing to hide their skepticism. Clara's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, refusing to let their judgment break her. Later in the evening, Clara excused herself to step outside. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. She leaned against the railing of the balcony, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. "You shouldn't be here." The voice startled her, and she turned to see Evelyn, Alexander's mother, standing a few feet away. The older woman's expression was cold, her posture rigid. Clara straightened, her defenses rising. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "This world isn't meant for someone like you. You're out of your depth, and you know it." Clara's fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm here because Alexander wants me here." Evelyn's lips curled into a thin smile. "Alexander is blinded by some misplaced sense of rebellion. But that won't last. Sooner or later, he'll realize that you're a liability." "A liability?" Clara repeated, her voice shaking with anger. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be in his life. He came to me. And you should have stayed away," Evelyn snapped. "If you care about him, you'll do what's best for him and leave before you ruin his reputation and his future." Clara's heart pounded as Evelyn's words sank in. She had spent her whole life fighting to survive, to carve out a place for herself in a world that seemed determined to push her down. But now, standing in the shadow of Alexander's world, she wondered if she was truly strong enough to fight this battle. Without another word, Clara turned and walked away, her chest tight with unshed tears. The next morning, Alexander woke to find a note on his bedside table. His heart sank as he recognized Clara's handwriting. "Alexander, I don't belong in your world, and I can't keep pretending that I do. You deserve someone who can stand beside you without dragging you down. Thank you for everything you've done for me, but this is where our paths end. Please don't look for me. Clara." The paper crumpled in his hand as Alexander sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. He couldn't believe she was gone. Clara had always been strong, always fought back, but he realized now that his family's cruelty had finally worn her down. He stood abruptly, throwing on a jacket and grabbing his keys. He wasn't going to let her leave without a fight. Clara sat in a small diner on the outskirts of the city, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of her. She had no destination, no plan, only the certainty that she couldn't stay in Alexander's life. As much as she loved him, she couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. His family would never accept her, and she didn't want to be the reason he lost everything he had worked for. The sound of the diner door opening barely registered, but when she heard his voice, her heart stopped. "Clara." She looked up to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of relief and determination. He walked toward her, ignoring the curious stares of the other diners. "You didn't think I'd let you go that easily, did you?" he said, sitting across from her. Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Alexander, you shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't have left," he countered. "Do you really think I care about what my family thinks? About their opinions or their approval? They're your family," Clara said, her voice breaking. "You've spent your whole life in their world. I don't fit into it, Alexander. I never will." Alexander reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Clara, my world isn't worth anything without you. I don't care about the money, the status, or the approval of people who can't see what I see in you. I care about you. And if I have to walk away from all of it to be with you, I will." Clara's breath caught as she searched his eyes, looking for any sign of hesitation. But all she saw was unwavering resolve. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she whispered. "I just want you to be happy. Then come back with me," Alexander said. "Let's build our own world, Clara. One where we don't have to answer to anyone but ourselves." For the first time in days, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. She said, "Let's do it." Returning to Alexander's world wasn't easy, but this time, Clara faced it with a renewed strength. She and Alexander worked together to create a life that reflected their values, not the expectations of others. Alexander began investing in projects that aligned with Clara's passions, including shelters for the homeless and community centers where people could learn skills to rebuild their lives. The first project they completed together was a shelter named Clara's Haven. At the grand opening, Clara stood beside Alexander as they cut the ribbon, her heart swelling with pride. This was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for. Evelyn and the rest of Alexander's family watched from the sidelines, their expressions unreadable. They had tried to stop him, but Alexander's determination had been unshakable. Now, as they saw the impact he and Clara were making, they began to realize just how wrong they had been. Months later, at a family gathering, Evelyn approached Clara. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I misjudged you. And I see now that you make Alexander happy." Clara nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't need your approval, Evelyn. But I'm glad you've come to understand what Alexander and I mean to each other." The tension between them eased, and while their relationship would never be perfect, it was a start. As Clara and Alexander walked home that evening, hand in hand, Clara looked up at him and smiled. "We did it," she said. "We did," Alexander agreed, squeezing her hand. "And this is just the beginning." Together, they had built something stronger than wealth or status. A life filled with purpose, love, and the unshakable belief that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Clara's Haven quickly became more than just a shelter. It became a symbol of hope and transformation. The community responded to the initiative with overwhelming support, and people from all walks of life began volunteering their time and resources. It wasn't long before Alexander and Clara realized they had sparked something much bigger than themselves. Every morning, Clara would visit the shelter, greeting the residents with a warm smile and offering encouragement. Many of them shared stories similar to hers, dreams abandoned, battles fought, and dignity lost to the unforgiving world. Clara listened to each one with compassion, always reminding them that their past did not define their future. One afternoon, as Clara sat with a young mother struggling to find work, Alexander entered the shelter, his suit slightly rumpled and a file tucked under his arm. He spotted Clara across the room and smiled, watching as she spoke with the woman, her voice gentle but filled with conviction. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Evelyn's voice startled him. He turned to find his mother standing in the doorway, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. Alexander hesitated before replying. "She's..." Evelyn sighed, stepping further inside. "I'll admit, I never thought I'd see the day you'd walk away from everything we built. But now, seeing what you and Clara have created here, I can't deny that it's extraordinary." Alexander studied his mother, searching for any trace of insincerity. To his surprise, there was none. "It's not about walking away," he said carefully. "It's about building something better, something that matters." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And it does matter. I see that now." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding hanging between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "I'd like to help." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Help?" With the shelter, Evelyn clarified. "If you'll allow it. I have connections, resources. I could make introductions, bring in donors." Alexander crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. "And what's your angle?" Evelyn met his gaze evenly. "No angle. Just a mother trying to make amends. Clara has shown me what it means to give selflessly, and I'd like to follow her example." Alexander considered her words carefully. He had spent his entire life navigating the complexities of his family, always wary of their motives. But for the first time, Evelyn's offer felt genuine. "I'll talk to Clara," he said finally. "If she's okay with it, then so am I." When Alexander shared Evelyn's offer with Clara later that evening, she was surprised but not dismissive. "People can change," she said thoughtfully. "If she truly wants to help, why not let her? This isn't about us, it's about the people who need this place." Alexander nodded, trusting Clara's judgment. The next day, Evelyn arrived at the shelter with a renewed sense of purpose, diving into the work with enthusiasm. Though it took time for Clara to fully trust her, the two women eventually found common ground in their shared goal of helping others. As the shelter grew, so did Alexander and Clara's influence. They began receiving invitations to speak at events, share their story, and advocate for systemic change. At first, Clara was reluctant to step into the spotlight, but Alexander encouraged her, reminding her that her voice had the power to inspire others. Their most significant moment came when they were invited to a national conference on social reform. The event was attended by politicians, business leaders, and activists from across the country, all eager to discuss solutions to the growing homelessness crisis. Clara stood backstage, nervously clutching the edges of her speech. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said softly. "Just speak from the heart, like you always do." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath as her name was announced. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. As the applause quieted, she glanced out at the sea of faces, feeling the weight of their expectations. "I'm not a politician or a business leader," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm just someone who knows what it feels like to be invisible. To feel like the world has given up on you." The room fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "For years, I believed that my circumstances defined me," Clara continued. "But then someone saw me, not for what I lacked, but for what I had to offer. That belief changed my life. And it's that belief we need to carry into every decision we make about homelessness and poverty." As Clara spoke, the audience was captivated. She shared stories from the shelter, highlighting the resilience and potential of the people society often overlooked. Her passion was undeniable, her words resonating with everyone in the room. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Clara stepped off the stage, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Alexander was waiting for her, his pride evident in the way he looked at her. "You were amazing," he said, pulling her into a hug. Clara smiled, her heart swelling. "I just told the truth." As the months passed, Alexander and Clara's efforts began to bear fruit. Clara's haven expanded into multiple locations, each one a beacon of hope for those in need. The initiative inspired similar projects across the country, creating a ripple effect that neither of them could have imagined. Their personal lives flourished as well. Alexander and Clara moved into a modest but beautiful home just outside the city, a space filled with warmth and love. They spent their evenings cooking together, sharing stories, and dreaming about the future. One day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alexander turned to Clara, his expression serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Clara raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to love, to fight for what matters, and to believe in something bigger than myself. Will you marry me?" Clara's breath caught as she stared at the ring, her heart racing. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Alexander, his face filled with hope and love. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'll marry you." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, and they laughed through their tears, holding each other tightly as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held at Clara's haven, surrounded by the people whose lives they had touched. The residents, volunteers, and friends all came together to celebrate the couple whose love had inspired so much change. As Clara walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her gaze locked on Alexander's. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not the judgment they had faced, the battles they had fought, or the challenges that still lay ahead. All that mattered was the love that had brought them to this point. When they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Alexander promised to stand by Clara's side through every storm, to support her dreams, and to love her for the rest of his life. Clara vowed to cherish the man who had seen her worth when no one else had, to build a life filled with purpose and joy. As they kissed, the room erupted into cheers, and Clara felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. She was no longer the woman sitting on a park bench, struggling to survive. She was a partner, a leader, and a symbol of what was possible when love and belief came together. Years later, as Clara and Alexander walked hand in hand through one of their shelters, they were greeted with smiles and waves from the residents. A young boy ran up to Clara, holding out a drawing he had made. "It's the new building you're working on." Clara knelt to examine the drawing, her smile widening. "This is incredible," she said, ruffling the boy's hair. "You're going to be an amazing architect one day." The boy beamed, and Clara stood, her heart full. She turned to Alexander, who was watching her with the same admiration he always had. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand. "And we're just getting started." Together, they walked toward the future they had built, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed a second chance. And in that future, love and hope would always lead the way. The years that followed were a testament to the strength of Alexander and Clara's partnership. Together, they built not only a life but a movement, one that inspired countless people across the country. Clara's haven had become a household name, a shining example of what compassion and determination could achieve. But as their success grew, so did the challenges. The more visibility they gained, the more criticism they faced from those who viewed their work as disruptive or unrealistic. Politicians and business leaders who had long profited from systems that perpetuated inequality were quick to dismiss their efforts. They're idealists, one talk show host sneered during a heated debate. Their little shelters might make them feel good, but they're not solving the root problem. Alexander watched the segment in their living room, his jaw tightening. "It's incredible how people can criticize without offering solutions," he muttered, tossing the remote onto the couch. Clara, who was reviewing designs at the kitchen table, looked up. "Let them talk," she said calmly. "Every person who comes through those doors knows the truth. That's what matters." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hate seeing you disrespected like that. You've worked harder than anyone to make this happen." Clara stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," she said. "But we've already changed so many lives. That's worth more than the opinions of people who don't understand what we're doing." Her words, as always, grounded him. Alexander nodded, pulling her into a hug. "You're right," he said softly. "You always are." Despite the criticism, the demand for Clara's haven continued to grow. New locations opened in cities across the country, each one tailored to meet the specific needs of its community. Clara and Alexander were constantly on the move, visiting sites, meeting with local leaders, and speaking at events to raise awareness. One day, during a visit to a newly opened shelter in Chicago, they met a man named Marcus. He was in his early 30s, with a weary look in his eyes that spoke of years spent fighting to survive. But as he shared his story, Clara saw something familiar, a spark of resilience, a determination to rise above his circumstances. "I used to be a teacher," Marcus said, his voice tinged with regret. "But after the school closed and I lost my job, everything fell apart. I couldn't keep up with the bills, and before I knew it, I was on the streets." Clara listened intently, her heart aching for him. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "This is a fresh start." Over the weeks that followed, Marcus became one of Clara's haven's success stories. He began volunteering at the shelter, teaching literacy classes to other residents and helping them build skills to re-enter the workforce. His transformation was a reminder of why Clara and Alexander had started this journey in the first place. But not every story had a happy ending. Some residents struggled to overcome the weight of their pasts, and Clara often lay awake at night, haunted by the faces of those she couldn't reach. "Do you ever feel like it's not enough?" she asked Alexander one evening as they sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. Alexander thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about the people we have helped. Marcus, the kids at the shelters, the families who found stability because of what you've built. That's more than enough." Clara nodded, her gaze distant. "I just wish we could do more." "You're already doing more than anyone else," Alexander said, taking her hand. "And as long as we keep going, we'll keep making a difference." Their work eventually caught the attention of an influential philanthropist named Eleanor Grant. Known for her vast wealth and commitment to social causes, Eleanor reached out to Clara and Alexander with an intriguing proposal. "I want to fund a national initiative," Eleanor said during their first meeting. "Something that combines your shelters with educational programs, job training, and mental health services. A comprehensive approach to tackling homelessness." Clara's eyes widened, excitement bubbling within her. "That's exactly what we've been dreaming of," she said. "But it's such a massive undertaking. Are you sure it's possible?" Eleanor smiled. "With your vision and my resources, I believe it is." The collaboration marked a new chapter for Clara's haven. The initiative, named Pathways to Promise, became a nationwide effort to provide holistic support for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Clara and Alexander worked closely with Eleanor to design the programs, ensuring they were both effective and empowering. The project required long hours and relentless dedication, but neither of them minded. They were driven by the belief that their work could create lasting change. As their professional lives flourished, Clara and Alexander also found time to focus on their personal happiness. They had settled into their role as partners, not just in their work but in every aspect of life. Their home was a sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of the outside world and simply be themselves. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie, Alexander turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about having kids?" he asked. Clara blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I haven't really thought about it," she admitted. "Why?" "I just think you'd be an amazing mom," Alexander said, a soft smile playing on his lips. "The way you care for people, the way you see the good in everyone. I can't think of a better person to raise a child." Clara's heart swelled at his words, but she hesitated. "I don't know," she said softly. "What if I mess it up? What if I'm not enough?" "You're more than enough," Alexander said firmly. "And we'd figure it out together, just like we always do." The idea lingered in Clara's mind over the following weeks, and as she watched the children at the shelters laughing and playing, she began to imagine what it might be like to have a family of her own. The thought both terrified and thrilled her, but with Alexander by her side, she felt ready to take the leap. A year later, Clara cradled a newborn in her arms, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. Alexander sat beside her, his face filled with awe as he gazed at their daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently brushing a finger against the baby's tiny hand. Clara smiled, her heart overflowing with love. "She's our miracle." They named her Grace, a symbol of the hope and resilience that had defined their journey. As they navigated the challenges of parenthood, Clara and Alexander found even greater purpose in their work. They wanted to build a world where Grace, and every child, could grow up surrounded by love and opportunity. The years passed, and Clara's haven continued to thrive. Clara and Alexander became advocates not just for the homeless but for systemic change, pushing for policies that addressed the root causes of poverty and inequality. Their work inspired a new generation of leaders, many of whom had once been residents of Clara's haven. At the 10-year anniversary of the shelter's founding, Clara stood on a stage in front of a crowd of thousands. She held Grace's hand as she addressed the audience, her voice steady and filled with pride. 10 years ago, this was just a dream, she said. A dream born out of pain and struggle, but also out of hope. Today, it's a reality that has changed lives and created opportunities where none existed before. The applause was deafening, and as Clara looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. None of this would have been possible without Alexander, without the people who had believed in her, and without the resilience of those who had walked through the doors of Clara's haven. After the event, Alexander found her backstage, wrapping his arms around her. "You were incredible," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Clara smiled, leaning into him. "We were incredible," she corrected. "And we still have so much more to do." Together, they stepped into the next chapter of their lives, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Their love had not only changed their own lives but had created a ripple effect that would be felt for generations to come. And in the end, that was all they had ever wanted. A chance to make the world a better place, one person, one shelter, and one dream at a time. As the years rolled on, Clara and Alexander's impact continued to grow, but so did the weight of their responsibilities. Balancing their personal lives with the demands of running a nationwide initiative was no small feat, and there were moments when the strain threatened to overwhelm them. One evening, Clara sat at her desk in their home office, poring over reports from the newest shelters they had opened. Alexander entered the room quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one down beside her and sat across from her, his own exhaustion mirroring hers. "You've been at this all day," he said gently. "You need a break." Clara sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, but there's so much to do. The shelter in Dallas needs more funding, the Chicago location is short-staffed, and we're still waiting for approval on the permits for the new site in Denver." Alexander reached across the desk and took her hand. "It's okay to step back sometimes, Clara. The world won't fall apart if you take a moment to breathe." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and frustration. "I just want to make sure we're doing enough." "You've done more than anyone could have imagined," Alexander said firmly. "But you can't carry all of this on your own. That's why we have a team, to share the load." Clara nodded slowly, realizing he was right. She had always struggled to delegate, feeling a personal responsibility for every detail. But as their work grew, she knew she couldn't do it all herself. That night, as they sat on the couch together, Alexander pulled out a folder he had been working on. "I've been thinking about ways to ease some of the pressure," he said, opening it to reveal a proposal for a leadership team to oversee the day-to-day operations of Clara's haven. Clara studied the document, her mind racing. The idea made sense. Bringing in experienced leaders to manage the shelters would free up time for her and Alexander to focus on the bigger picture. But it also meant trusting others with something so deeply personal. "Do you think we're ready for this?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I think it's the next step," Alexander said. "We've built something incredible, but if we want it to last, we need to let others take the reins in some areas." Clara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're right. As usual." Alexander grinned. "I'll never get tired of hearing that." With a new leadership team in place, Clara and Alexander found themselves with more time to focus on long-term strategies. They began working on partnerships with educational institutions and corporations, creating programs that offered not just housing but pathways to stable careers. One such partnership was with a major university that agreed to provide scholarships for residents of Clara's Haven who showed academic promise. Clara was deeply involved in the selection process, reading through essays and meeting with applicants. Each story reminded her of why they had started this journey. One day, she met a young woman named Alina, who had grown up in foster care and spent years drifting between shelters before finding stability at Clara's Haven. Alina had a passion for engineering, and her essay detailed her dream of designing sustainable housing for underserved communities. "You remind me of myself," Clara told her during their interview. "You see challenges as opportunities, not obstacles." Alina smiled shyly. "That's because of what you've built." Clara's Haven gave me a chance to believe in myself. The university awarded Alina a full scholarship, and her success became a beacon of hope for others at the shelter. Clara and Alexander kept in touch with her, watching with pride as she excelled in her studies and began designing innovative solutions for affordable housing. Despite the progress they had made, Clara and Alexander knew there was still much work to be done. They continued to face resistance from those who viewed their efforts as disruptive or unrealistic, but they refused to back down. One particularly challenging moment came when a major donor, who had supported Clara's Haven for years, decided to withdraw their funding. The loss was a significant blow, and the news sent shockwaves through their organization. "We'll figure it out," Alexander said, trying to reassure Clara as they sat in their office late one night. "We've faced setbacks before. But this is different," Clara said, her voice heavy with frustration. "We rely on that funding to keep several shelters running. If we can't replace it, those people will be left without support." Alexander leaned forward, his expression determined. "Then we'll find a way to replace it. Whether it's through new donors, grants, or even cutting back on some of our own expenses, we'll make it work. We always do." Clara nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. Over the next few weeks, they launched a fundraising campaign, reaching out to their network and sharing stories of the lives they had changed. The response was overwhelming, and within a month, they had not only replaced the lost funding but exceeded their original goal. The experience reminded Clara of the power of community, the way people came together when they believed in a common purpose. It also reinforced her belief in the importance of transparency and accountability, values that had always been at the heart of Clara's Haven. As the years passed, Clara and Alexander's lives continued to evolve. Grace grew into a bright and curious child, her parents' love and determination shaping her view of the world. She often accompanied them to the shelters, chatting with residents and helping with small tasks. One day, as they walked through a new shelter in development, Grace tugged on Clara's hand. "Mama, why do some people not have homes?" Clara knelt down, looking into her daughter's wide, inquisitive eyes. "Sometimes life is unfair," she said gently. "But that's why we're here, to help make it better." Grace nodded, her expression serious. "When I grow up, I want to help too." "You already are," Alexander said, smiling as he ruffled her hair. "And I know you'll do amazing things." Grace beamed, and Clara felt a swell of pride. Their journey hadn't been easy, but moments like this reminded her of why it was all worth it. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Clara and Alexander reflected on everything they had accomplished. The shelters, the partnerships, the lives they had touched. It was more than either of them had ever imagined. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Clara asked, resting her head on Alexander's shoulder. "Always," he replied. "But for now, I'm just grateful for what we've built. And for you." Clara smiled, her heart full. "I'm grateful for you too. None of this would have been possible without you." Alexander tilted his head, looking at her with a mixture of love and admiration. I think we both know that's not true. You're the heart of all of this, Clara. You always have been. Clara's eyes glistened as she reached for his hand. We're better together, she said softly. And I wouldn't trade this for anything. As they sat in comfortable silence, the stars above them shining like tiny beacons of hope, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, she allowed herself to simply be, to savor the life they had built and the love that had guided them through it all. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their hearts and hands united in the unshakable belief that they could make the world a better place.